All around the world, there are strange reports of man-like canine beasts. They go by many names: shapeshifters, beasts, dogmen, and Manwolf. In the Old English town of Hexham, 1970 proved to be a year for all manner of unexplained activity. The discovery of 2 potentially ancient stone artifacts is often suggested to have been some sort of catalyst for reports of animal-human apparitions, including that of a werewolf.
The Hexham Heads is a case that comes from 1971, wherein 2 boys from a family known as the Robsons dug up 2 small stone heads in the family's backyard. They were perhaps baseball size, maybe a little bit smaller, and both of them were very strange, eerie depictions of human faces. And the origin of the heads, where they came from, who made them, is one of the facts about this story that we still don't have answers to. Speculation has been that they were perhaps Celtic in origin, made by Druidic tribes perhaps that may have lived in the area long before. But the area in which they were found is an area known as Hexham, and that's why they're called the Hexham Heads. The history of Hexham is ancient and goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. It actually is home to one of the oldest buildings in England, which was constructed in 1330, and it sits there to this day. We don't know what the connection of the heads is necessarily to the phenomena that came after it, but as soon as they were uncovered, things began to get strange.
Colin and Leslie Robson dug up these little stone heads that were about 6 centimeters in height in their home garden. And when they did that, they brought it into the house, and these strange occurrences started to happen. The heads would seemingly move on their own to different parts of the room when no one was in the room. Sometimes bottles would be thrown across the room in a very dramatic way. It wasn't solely relegated to the Robson home. Instead, it actually trickled over to the Dodd family, which was next door, where one of the young boys was actually pulled by his hair, and the mother got up and saw this half-man, half-goat-like creature leaving the house. An expert in Celtic artifacts named Anne Ross heard about this and actually took the Hexham Heads to study them, and shortly thereafter began to have experiences of her own. In one instance, she woke up to see this half-man, half-wolf-like creature leaving her bedroom and walking down the stairs. So she actually followed it down the stairs, and it kind of turned the corner going towards her kitchen, and she lost sight of it and it disappeared. Her daughter actually had a similar experience to where she saw this werewolf-like creature, as her daughter described it, standing on top of the stairs, where it kind of jumped over the banister, went down the hallway, and then disappeared. Various other times her doors would open on their own, and she ended up getting rid of the Hexham Heads, and all of those experiences stopped. So Anne Ross attributed all of those experiences to the actual Hexham Heads themselves.
One of the reasons the Hexham Heads even ended up in Anne Ross's care is because she was somebody who could give potentially a conclusive view of the background of the heads, where they came from, what culture would have made them, how old they were. They were being seen as these sort of paleontological cultural artifacts. But whether or not they actually were that is another matter, because even though Anne Ross asserted that she did believe that the heads were of an ancient origin of some kind, mostly due to the hairstyle and the actual build of the heads being similar to what we would see in Celtic artifacts, there is some discrepancy. Now, it is true that these heads, for whatever it's worth, do really greatly resemble a lot of known Celtic artifacts that are in places like the British Museum. We know that the Celtic culture, which was widespread throughout all the British Isles by the point that the heads of the British Museum would have been created, made a lot of artifacts that had to do with facial structure. So you have a lot of these face plates and these, admittedly, very similar to the Hexham Head stone heads, that really have these similar features, like the shape of the eyes, the way that the nose is very kind of straightly constructed, etc., etc. And of course, these heads are often kind of smaller in size and are made out of these rounded stones. So there is a lot of reason to, at least at a glance, have reason to believe that these stone heads were of some kind of Celtic origin. There's no reason, considering location, that they wouldn't have wound up where they wound up, and there's no reason, given the physical appearance of the heads, that Celtic would be a bad assumption. Now, of course, that hinges a lot in the story, because there's this view that the Hexham heads, being these kind of ancient cultural artifacts, had some kind of phenomenon associated with them and with their old age that somehow contributed to the mystery going on here. But there are also more in-depth analyses on the heads that suggest a potentially more modern origin. A lot of the analyses that contradict each other, unfortunately, are listed in the book Tales of the Hexham Heads. It's a small sort of book/pamphlet that was published by Paul Screeton, and it references a particular study that was published into a report by one D.A. Robson, who was with the University of Geology of Newcastle upon Tyne in 1974. And according to his report, it seemed like there was a composition that the heads were made of that seemed to be some kind of artificial cement, which is something that not only we have people saying that they worked with to make the heads, this person who claimed that they made the heads themselves, but that would be something that really places it more in the modern era. Now, of course, there are also some caveats with that. The report also mentions that there are some other details about the location and about the kinds of sand and grain found in the heads that could be explained by either modern or ancient means. But we kind of have this one big point in terms of the chemical structure that leads us to believe modern, and at the same time, if the story about the construction of these heads being just for someone's daughter to be true, there's no aim to make them a sort of Celtic in appearance hoax, and yet they have these really strong ties to Celtic imagery. So it's kind of an interesting phenomenon in that way.
The heads were passed to another person and then to another person before they finally disappeared altogether, and in the modern day, their whereabouts are unknown.
I find it interesting because I'm not well versed. I don't know of any other stories that specifically in regards to holding on to a specific object would call in a werewolf or a dogman. But in terms of the paranormal field, which is where I think this could be explained better, is in the terms of cursed objects or even possessed objects. Plenty of stories that I've heard where people would find a Native American artifact, or a person would get like a chair or something from a garage sale that just didn't have a good feeling to it, and they would bring it into their home, and it would be followed up by paranormal experiences. Doors would open, entities would appear, and the only way to stop that stuff is to get rid of the object, or to return the object back into the ground, especially when it comes to Native American stuff being dug up. And some of these entities seem to bear the resemblance of half man, half goat, or half man, half dog. And so that raises a lot of questions as well. Like, why is it taking those forms? Is it just because they're scary to us? Or is there something going on that we don't understand spiritually, paranormally?
A few years before his book was published, Paul Screeton reports that he was contacted by a Don Robbins, who had his own explanation for what might be going on with the Hexham Heads phenomenon that really was quite interesting and relates to some modern theory that we have. Essentially, he believed that there was something about the mineral composition of certain objects that might be able to induce, through electrical signal that is received by the brain neurologically, some kind of hallucinogenic phenomenon, if we can call it that. Essentially, he wanted to assert that there was a link between what you might be able to describe as electrical imagery and the mineral composition of an object. And this spans into other theories as well. There's lots of theories about certain kinds of crystalline minerals and of things like granite that might be conducive for the same kind of property. But he really outlines it very thoroughly that he believed that there was a link between specifically electrical imagery, sort of a holographic image, if you want to call it that, and natural mineral composition. Don Robbins wrote, "The structure of a mineral, therefore, can be seen as a fluctuating energy network with infinite possibilities of storage and transformation of electronic information. These new dimensions in physical structure may well point the way eventually to an understanding of kinetic imagery encoded in stone." The theory that he's proposing here eventually became known not really from him, but just from sort of the collective efforts of people who thought like him, as the theory of stone tape, or the stone tape theory, which essentially asserts that information can be stored in mineral composition, in that our brains, under the right conditions, actually receive information stored within those mineral compositions, which we don't have a whole lot of physical science to back that up, or geological science to back that up. But it is interesting that in terms of our modern technology, we do have something like a computer, which for all intents and purposes is a system of mineral compositions combined with electrical impulses, which are controlled by the user, that manipulate photons in order to produce images. So whether or not the Hexam heads had some sort of stone tape-esque feeling or property to them, the stone tape idea for the Hexam heads is a really interesting one, because in a lot of ways it was kind of ahead of its time. Of course, stone tape theory is often used now to talk about, these ancient castles that are supposedly haunted, that may be instead storing time-relative information, things like that. And again, we don't have any geological information to really back that up whatsoever, no data. But it is interesting that that phenomenon is theorized. It links us in a lot of ways to the admittedly really weirdly ancient themes that we see across the Hexam head story. And what I mean by that is there's something about the images that people who owned the heads, or were within proximity of the heads, reported that harkens back thousands and thousands of years in cultures all around the world, specifically in the image of the goat man, and in this case the dog man or the werewolf. Whether or not those phenomenon in and of themselves, especially of course in this case the phenomenon of the dog man, are related to this is kind of unknown. It's hard to use the Hexam head case as data for this, but there is something psychological about the Hexam head story that goes just beyond hallucinogenic property and kind of goes into deeper psychology, or at least potentially goes into deeper psychology. After all, the image of the goat man and the dog man, or the werewolf and the horn/antlered man, are deeply archetypal images that are expressed across many different cultures. Archetypes were sort of brought to the forefront of psychology by Carl Jung in the 20th century, a European psychologist who really delved into the unconscious images and the unconscious and subconscious thought processes that humans go through. He documented a lot of phenomenon that now is very well known and used commonly in the field of psychology, in psychiatry, etc., etc. But for the time, he was cutting edge. And he had his own idea about where these images in culture came from. Because you think about it and you see that almost every culture on the planet has an antlered person, or a horned person, or a goat man. And every culture also has a werewolf of some kind, a shapeshifter related to wild canids, especially wolves. So one of the questions might be, well, how does that fit into the idea of archetypes? Those might be called archetypes because of their prevalence, despite the fact that a lot of these cultures didn't have contact with each other. And Carl Jung thought that that might indicate that there was something about the image of the werewolf, as an example, that brings subconscious ideas, specific subconscious ideas, to the forefront of thought. And because all of us are experiencing the same world, of course, in various different lenses, but still the same world, maybe there was some kind of uniting subconscious interpretation of the world that was commonly expressed as a wild canid in subconscious imagery. There's a wonderful quote from him that really explains his process in examining what could be archetypal images in dreams, particularly, which he wrote in a letter to one of his colleagues.
When unconscious content emerges into consciousness, it can affect this transition only by clothing itself with the ideas existing in consciousness, thereby becoming perceptible. As to how things look in the unconscious, that is beyond our ken. Hence, I define the archetypes as irrepresentable forms which clothe themselves with different material, varying with each experience. The archetypal character of certain traditional images can probably never be established as due to an immediate primordial experience. One can conclude that the experience expressed an archetype only by demonstrating through comparative research that the same or very similar images occur in quite other cultures and also as verifiable primordial experiences of modern individuals. The historical explanation of a symbol has therefore always to be sought first in its own cultural sphere, and then one must demonstrate the occurrence of the same or similar symbols in other cultural spheres in order to support the assertion that it can be an archetype. But this assertion becomes absolutely certain only when in a modern dream, and moreover an individual who has never had any contact with those corresponding traditions. That, at any rate, is the procedure that I follow.
I don't think we can attribute it to necessarily a Dogman case because it shares so many other components of other paranormal stories. And maybe that points to a paranormal origin for Dogman. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if we can say that because the presence of a half-man, half-goat-like creature also calls into question a lot of that as well, right? So the presence of a half-man, half-goat-like creature seems to call into question it being a strictly dogman-like phenomena. So the story of the Hexam Heads leaves us with more questions than answers, at least in my opinion.
There are other archetypes that Carl Jung explored, like the winged man, which he himself purported to have experienced in a sort of state of semi-psychosis that he once experienced, this sort of waking dream that he had, where he experienced seeing, quote-unquote seeing in his subconscious, of course, a man with the sort of feathers and wings of a blue or green hummingbird. And you might even be able to relate that to some more Fortean phenomenon or cryptozoological phenomenon like the Mothman, for example. Or in a more literal sense and more concrete sense, all of these images of winged people that we see in Mesoamerican cultures. There's something uniting about these images. Carl Jung saw that, and there is this idea that maybe under the right conditions, whatever those conditions may be, subconscious images can actually be experienced. We know that that happens with hallucinogenic drugs, of course. Whether or not the Hexam Heads are a part of that is, of course, unknown, and now that we don't know where the heads are, will probably never be known. But this whole cryptid archetype theory, this idea that cryptozoological phenomenon is in itself often archetypal phenomenon, and that archetypal experiences can be induced, is something that really seems to, at the very least, fit nicely into the Hexam Heads mystery. And what exactly that means, of course, is unsolvable.